Well, hello everyone. Hope you're doing well. So, for next week's class in Borgesian philosophy, we're going to be talking about Death in the Compass. Death in the Compass is one of my favorite Borges stories. In fact, it's become probably my favorite Borges story in the last couple of weeks and months. I think it's also one of Borges' best stories. It's a difficult story. It's not as difficult, you'll be relieved to learn, as Plan Ukvar Orbis Tertius, but it has certain complexities that I think will create obstacles for our understanding and our enjoyment of the story. So I thought it might be useful to provide a bit of introduction to Death in the Compass, just to provide some context, and I think most critically to give you some idea about what you ought to be looking for as you read the story. I want to do this introduction in three parts. I want to talk about the story under three headings, and I'll make three separate videos for these headings so that the videos don't swell to unmanageable proportions. But the three headings are: first, Death in the Compass as a piece of detective fiction. Second, Death in the Compass is a piece of Jewish fiction. Not, it's important to note, a piece of fiction written by a Jewish person, but a piece of fiction that depends for its coherence upon our understanding of certain aspects of Jewish theology, culture, and religious practice. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the importance, even the centrality of symmetry in Death in the Compass. So in this presentation, I'm just going to be talking about Death in the Compass as a piece of detective fiction. So the first thing to note is that Death in the Compass is in fact a piece of detective fiction. Well, what does that mean? It means a couple of different things. First, and I think most basically, it means that when Borges is writing this story, he's writing within a particular literary tradition. That is to say, he's writing within a tradition that's already populated by a number of other important detective writers. You may be familiar with some of them. For instance, Borges regularly makes reference to this writer, G.K. Chesterton, an English writer from the early part of the 20th century. And he's most famous, at least in detective fiction, for his Father Brown stories. Borges was a great fan, an avid reader of Chesterton, and makes reference to him all the time. So this is a piece that we ought to keep in mind as we're working through Death in the Compass. Of course, in English, the father of detective fiction is Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe, if you've ever read, I don't know, Murders in the Rue Morgue or The Purloined Letter, you will have been exposed to Edgar Allan Poe's famous detective Auguste Dupin. If you're not familiar with Chesterton or Poe's detective fiction, you've almost certainly heard of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. And if you haven't read the Sherlock Holmes stories, you may have seen the BBC remake with Benedict Cumberbatch, Sherlock. So, first thing to note is that Borges is writing within this tradition of detective fiction. And even if you're not familiar with detective fiction in a literary sense, you are familiar with detective fiction as an idea. Detective fiction is, in fact, one of the most popular and enduring genres of literature, and it's made its way in a variety of senses into television. So think of all the sort of police procedural shows that you've seen, things like CSI or NCIS or Castle, or going back a few years, Columbo. Right? There are all sorts of shows that are sort of based around the conventions of detective fiction. So with this in mind, we have to ask, what is detective fiction? What are its conventions? What are its premises? What does it assume in its reader? What is it trying to do to us and for us? Well, if you think about any episode of CSI or any episode of NCIS or any piece of detective fiction that you've ever read, you recall that it almost always starts with a problem. And that problem is generally a crime. So every episode of CSI, every episode of NCIS that I've ever watched, the first scene is someone's died, someone's been beaten, someone's been burglarized, some problem has been presented, and that problem is a crime. The rest of the show is then, of course, devoted to an investigation. That is to say, an attempt on the part of a detective or a team of detectives to figure out who is responsible for the crime. That's generally how detective fiction works, and it's, of course, in a kind of way how Death in the Compass works. Now, if that's the way that detective fiction works in general, if that's almost invariably the sort of narrative arc of a piece of detective fiction, that is to say, crime and investigation and discovery of the person responsible for it, what does that tell us about detective fiction? What are its sort of conceptual foundations and its conceptual presuppositions? Well, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that given its almost invariable narrative arc, detective fiction is always a dramatization, a literary, an imaginative dramatization of a process of reasoning. Well, what does that mean? That means that literary fiction works by dramatizing the process of human reasoning. Just think about it for a second. In the opening scene of a show, the opening page of a story, someone is killed. The detective team shows up, and what do they immediately begin to do? Well, they begin to look for evidence. They begin to look for clues. They begin to look for things that will point them in the direction of the killer, of the person responsible for the crime. Yeah. What are they doing then? They are engaging in an act of reasoning. They have a problem, a mystery. Someone killed this person in an untoward, unhandsome way. And now we have to figure out who was responsible for it. And of course, we can't ask the person because the person is dead. So we have to look at the evidence that surrounds the crime in order to figure out what that evidence points to or whom that evidence points to. This is the way that detective fiction always works. It's always sort of dramatizing the process whereby human beings examine evidence and then draw conclusions on the basis of that evidence. This means, in turn, that detective fiction always presupposes the power, the potency of human reason. So think about every episode of NCIS you've ever watched. Do they ever not figure out who the killer is? Do they ever not figure out who is responsible for blowing up the submarine? No, they always figure it out. They always figure it out because detective fiction as a genre depends on the power of the human mind to examine evidence and to deduce conclusions from that evidence, which in the case of detective fiction always point you to the person responsible for the crime. So detective fiction presupposes a really strong link between the world out there and the power of the human mind to understand, to sort of piece together bits of that reality to draw a firm conclusion. Now, by this point, you've read enough Borges to know that Borges is extremely skeptical of the power of the human mind to understand reality, of the power of human language to express reality. You won't be surprised to learn, as you read Death in the Compass, that Borges is writing in full awareness of this convention of detective fiction, and he is, of course, going to play with it. He's going to subvert it, undermine it, call it into question in various ways. That's the first thing you ought to be looking out for as you're reading Death in the Compass. Given the presumptions, given the conventions of detective fiction, given its commitment to and belief in the power of the human mind to examine evidence and draw conclusions, how is Borges' story different? What is he doing to those conventions? So that's the first thing to keep in mind, and it's simply a function of the fact that Death in the Compass is a piece of detective fiction. Very well, so keep that in mind as you're reading. In the next presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of Jewish components of the story. They're equally central, and if we don't understand them, we're going to miss out on a lot of the enjoyment that the story can provide to us. So until then, enjoy reading, and I will talk to you soon.